Okay, let's talk a little bit about globalist, internationalist,
Yeah,
that kind of thing.
yeah.
The reason I want to talk about that is, when you look at the TikTok deal, Larry Ellison, for example, there's footage floating that he was talking how important Israel is, and then you combine that with Netanyahu openly said right now the most important purchase is TikTok.
Mhm.
So it seems like for these Zionist oligarchies in the United States, these are US citizens. Michael Dell is another one, and Anderson Holowitz.
Yeah,
All these are Zionist Americans. Their loyalty should be with United States.
yeah.
But it does, I don't feel that. I don't feel their
No,
loyalty is with United States. I'm
no,
not even sure their loyalty is so much towards Israel, although
no.
that seems like they're claiming. But if they're truly loyal to Israel, they should know what Israel right now is doing. It's hurting Israel in the long run. So these people, I think you guys, at Duran, you call them the globalist. Can you
Yes.
explain to my
Yes,
audience who
yes,
are these
yes,
people?
yes, because I think a very key thing to understand is that when China talks about globalization, for example,
Hmm.
it means something completely
Yes.
different.
Yeah.
I mean, the Chinese idea of globalization is a system where countries, nations, people in those nations are able to trade and conduct business and good economic relations with
Yeah.
each other
Hmm.
in conditions of peace and stable international stability. And there are accepted rules and norms which are followed. And effectively, what they're talking about is, as I said, a stable international system which covers world trade
Hmm.
and in which everybody, every nation has a particular economic stake. So, I mean, that's the Chinese conception of globalization,
Yeah.
which is an uncontroversial one, by the way, and ought to be uncontroversial, and which is a very, very long storied history in the West. In the 19th century, for example, the free traders in Britain who were opposed to empire, it's
Hmm.
important to say this, and opposed to war, had people like Cobden and Bright and Adam Smith going back further, that they would have endorsed this vision that China has. China is sometimes referred to as a mercantilist
Hmm.
system where the state controls everything and controls trade in order to accumulate power and all of that. That was the system that Cobden, Bright, Adam Smith, and Ricard and all those people opposed. But China's actual rhetoric and praxis is quite different. It aligns more, as I said, with the 19th century British free traders. So that's China's vision of globalization. Now, what my colleague Alex Christofor, and
Hmm.
I mean when we
Hmm.
talk about globalization is something completely different.
Hmm.
For us, globalization is a economic and social and political structure where a defined class of people have basically separated themselves from their societies and their states,
Yeah.
no longer treat states, nations, as valid entities, uh, reject any attempts by states to place constraints on their behavior, for example, by requiring them to pay taxes.
Hmm.
That's a key
Hmm.
thing. And basically function outside the traditional nation state based system as sort of entities that exist beyond it. And to the extent that they recognize certain particular states, like the United States, as important, it's because they see those particular states, like the United States, as their first and foremost to protect their interests,
Hmm.
their supranational interests,
Hmm.
and to enforce the system that benefits specifically themselves. So we're talking about, if you like, an international oligarchy
Yeah.
of money that is no longer politically or institutionally anchored. Now, that absolutely does not exist in China. I mean, you
Hmm.
don't have anybody. I mean, name any Chinese businessman, he or she
Hmm.
remains a Chinese business person. They're not international business people or cosmopolitan business people in the way that the people we've just been talking about are. And you're absolutely correct. I mean, yes, I mean, some of them may have some sentimental feelings about Israel, but
Hmm.
ultimately, it's not about Israel. It's
Hmm.
about the system of global wealth and power that is concentrated in themselves. And undoubtedly, they do believe at some level that this is the future of humanity, a kind of, you know, non-political system. And I suspect that some of them probably believe that not only is it the future of humanity, but that it is human progress, that they are the people who, better than states, nations, and governments and electorates, are best qualified to chart the way forward for humanity in the future. So it's a profoundly different type of globalization. And it absolutely does exist, by the way, and they write extensively about themselves. There's no shortage of commentary and discussion and all of that about this. And it all is bound up with concepts like the rules based international
Uh-huh.
order,
Uh-huh.
which is, of course, all about the rules they set and which benefit themselves. And of course, the United States too. But then the United States, as I said, is the instrument through which the system is created and through which it is enforced. But closing factories in America, shutting down factories, firing workers, plundering the US itself, that is not something that they feel they should not do
Hmm.
because they don't have a the kind of social responsibility that um, would expect of, say, rich people in China, and there aren't the political and administrative and legal constraints on them that would restrain that behavior there anyway. So that is the difference.
Well, I have so many questions. So is that part of, I think that's part of the reason I don't feel United States even a fully independent country,
Mm,
considering, for example, how much influence Israel has. And not
yeah,
only Israel, but South Africa. You see, if I tell you Trump and the refugee in the same sentence, you will find that very strange. Why would Trump, care about refugee? Well, he's established a program for South African white farmers.
yeah,
And why does he do that? Because, Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, David Sachs, these South Africans clearly have influence over him
yeah,
to set up this program.
yes,
How do I know that? Well, because the US farmers is complaining about that Trump seems care more about the South African farmers than they care about the US farmers.
yeah,
And of course, some people are always concerned about the British influence and the European influence over the
yes,
US policies.
yes.
So do you agree that US is actually not a fully independent country because of that?
Oh, I would completely agree. And I would add, by the way, that these ideas, this concept of globalization that we've just been talking about, has ultimately a European origin. I
Uh-huh.
mean, you remember that Europe, as we've discussed in many places, is a fractured collection of different states. But it is undoubtedly true that basically from the 1940s a European elite began to form, which conceived of itself as European, as opposed to French, German, Spanish, Italian, or whatever it
Hmm.
was, and a lot of the original thinking came, which has created this system of globalization that we're talking about, originated in Europe, and a lot of it, of course, originated in Britain as
Hmm.
well, which has always been a country with a very, very strong oligarchical, system within its political DNA. So, absolutely, and the United States um, is. very much trapped into and subservient to this system. Um, we saw this play out very strongly in 2008, for example, during the financial crisis. I mean, remember the very different way in which China and the US handled the financial crisis. China began a massive program of economic reflation, which is intended to boost the economy and increase aggregate demand. The United States bailed out the banks, not
Yeah.
just its own banks,
Hmm.
but those of the West, and of course the other central banks in the West and governments there played that very same role. Is
Hmm.
again a completely different response to the crisis that arose then. And again, it tells you very much about where the priorities are. In China, the priority is development. It's on China itself. In the West, it is on preserving the international financial system, which is, of course, what underpins the entire system of globalization that we were just talking about.
Well, part of some people explain why Besant involved in bailout
Yeah.
Argentina is because some of his Wall Street friends was bidding. They were betting on Argentina. So
Yeah.
if Argentina totally collapse, some of his friends will lose big money. So that is one of the explanation. And then again, it's not to serve the best interest of the United States. Why does the United States need to bail out Argentina?
Well, the
Regardless of
United
what
States
happened to the soybeans, right? It's just what? Why? Why would you do that?
the
Right.
United States has no reason to support Argentina. It's throwing good money after bad money because
Yeah.
the government in Argentina is going to fail, and its economic policy is completely misconceived, and Argentina repeatedly defaults. And by the way, I'm not saying this as any kind of critique of Argentina and its
Hmm.
people. I think that they have been disastrously ill served
Yeah.
by, again, an economic oligarchy. But this is another story which we will have to discuss on a completely different day. But you're absolutely right. I mean, Argentina is being bailed out at the moment, not to help Argentina, but in order to preserve
Uh,
this, myth of Millet as this great revolutionary libertarian and all of that, but also mostly because not just friends of Bassett, but all kinds of people within
uh-huh.
the United States placed bets
Uh,
on Millet and his success, which of course plays completely up to what they want, because the way in which Millet has reorganized or tried to reorganize the economy in Argentina is one which completely works to the interests of these globalist influences that we're talking about. Anyway, they placed bets on him, and they're worried that they will lose them. There's somebody put it very well at the time of the 2008 financial crisis: socialism for the rich,
yeah. Yeah.
capitalism, predatory capitalism for the poor.
Yeah. And then how do you put internationalist, compared to
Yeah.
this? What's the difference
Yes.
there?
Yeah, okay. So internationalism, and remember, I was part of the old social democratic socialist European left. My
Hmm.
father, as I've discovered, I mean, he clearly had communist sympathies.
Uh-huh.
Anyway, so this is very much the old world of which I was a part of, and it basically developed. It was a conception that developed in the 19th century, and it is very much connected with Karl Marx and the
Hmm.
influence of Karl Marx. And the point was that Marx said that beyond it, beyond everything, there is class struggle. There is the struggle between classes, and it currently in the current period of history, this expresses itself as within the struggle that is taking place within capitalist societies between capital and labor. And out of that, the understanding grew within the international working class trade union movements, mostly in Europe, but also to some extent the United States, that since capital is organized internationally, so a capitalist in New York can invest and build a factory in Germany and
Mhm.
can play off workers in Germany against workers in the United States, just as capitalism is organized internationally, so should labor be.
Okay.
And out of this grew the view that workers in all countries, and bear in mind, we're talking about the 19th and early 20th century. So this is mostly European and
Mhm.
Western countries at that time. But workers had more in common with each other than they had with the capitalist masters who were exploiting them. And out of this idea that international working class solidarity, the solidarity of oppressed peoples, um, out of that was where it developed. And then after the Russian Revolution, it developed further still because the Soviet Union established itself as the first socialist state, and the state that represented the interests of the working class, the proletariat.
Mhm.
And so one of the other aspects in the 1930s and 40s and 1920s too was that part of international working class solidarity was to support the worker state, which was the Soviet Union. Now, that caused a lot of trouble later because, of course, the Soviets then, after the Second World War, claimed that that gave them a kind of primacy in the international communist movement. And that was obviously rejected, specifically in China as well. And we all know the tensions and the story. But you can see what left wing internationalism was all about. I lived through all of this.
Mhm.
I was absolutely part of this. I can remember that when workers went on strike in Britain, workers in Germany, for example, it was in a car factory in
Mhm.
Britain went on strike. Workers in a car factory in Germany would restrict their labor so that if cars would not be exported from Germany to Britain
Mhm.
in order to undermine the striking workers in Britain.
Mhm.
And, right up until the 1970s, this was absolutely part of the pattern of industrial relations and internationalism. And then, of course, it also expanded into anti-imperialism that people in the European colonies were part of the oppressed. So internationalism meant being anti-imperialist, and this
Mhm.
is very important.
Mhm.
So when Gandhi came to Britain, for example, in the 1930s, working class communities came out and supported him because they supported Indian independence and
Mhm.
were opposed, by the way, strongly opposed to all attempts to maintain and preserve the empire in all sorts of places. And you could see how all of that developed. It's something that doesn't exist in the West anymore.
Mhm. This is interesting. So it's almost like the opposite. So the globalists are
Yeah.
the borderless capital, and
Yes.
the internationalists are borderless union workers. A little bit
Yes,
like.
and except that internationalism never involved not being patriotic about your own country.
Uh-huh. Okay, that's
So,
good.
so, 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 a British worker would remain a British
Mhm.
worker.
Mhm.
A German worker would remain
Yeah.
a German worker. All of that. A Russian worker would remain
Hmm.
a Russian worker. But so it was not about extinguishing nation
Uh-huh.
states or
Okay.
ending patriotism and all of that, but the sense that workers around the world needed to support each other because the capitalists otherwise would play them all off against each other and would win the game. You could argue that what happened in the West in 1989, after 1989, 1991, the fall of the Soviet Union, is that the capitalists did win the game,
Uh-huh.
and it's out of that, in a sense, that globalization, as we now understand it, really gained force. The ideas about globalization in the West go back to the 1940s and began to gain institutional expression in Europe in the 1960s.
So the internationalist is about the solidarities, right? So workers.
Solidarity,
Yeah.
exactly.
Okay.
That is the fundamental thing. And by the way, China, I mean, the Cold War was absolutely part of this. I mean, it was.
Uh-huh. Okay.
China uh, played an absolutely essential role, for example, in the national liberation movements in Africa in the
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
1960s and 1970s. I mean, they were always there.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Um, yeah, I think fundamentally the US problem is being controlled by the like a borderless capital oligarchies.
Yeah.
They don't care about this country. They really don't.
Correct.
Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely correct. Whereas workers always
Uh-huh.
care about
Care
their
about the
countries
countries. Yeah.
because they
Yeah.
live there. You
Yeah.
see, a globalist oligarchic
Mm-hmm.
businessman, where he or she lives
Mm-hmm.
ultimately doesn't matter.
Yeah, yeah. And Peter Thiel even said in one of his interviews, he said himself, he said, "Oh, if Trump doesn't win this, I'm going to leave." So for him, it's like, okay,
Yeah,
if things doesn't go my way,
yeah,
I'll move somewhere else, you know. So
absolutely.
he doesn't have this, yeah. And he remember he comes from South Africa, originally from
Yeah.
East
Yes.
Germany, yeah. So for
Yes.
him, it doesn't matter where he lives. So
Yeah.